So, we talked about the neuromuscular junction last week. We talked about that excitation coupling, um, excitation contraction coupling. And so just be good at telling that little story about how that action potential is going to eventually cause a muscle contraction. And then I left you guys talking about muscle responses. So we had muscle twitch, we had trep, we've got complete and incomplete tetanus, that sort of thing. All right. What you need to know about more about skeletal muscle is that skeletal muscle exhibits what's called an all or none response. All right. That means that the contraction will be equal to the strength of that action potential. No action potential, no muscle contraction. Okay? Action potential, muscle contraction. All right? So it's not like, it's not like the whole EPSP thing that we talked about where you produce excitatory postsynaptic potentials, and if it reaches threshold, then you get a response. All right? Action potential, muscle contraction. If you don't have the first one, you're not going to have the latter. Now, in order to increase that strength of that particular contraction, you have to increase the number of motor units that are stimulated within that muscle, whole muscle or muscle group. So remember, a motor unit is going to be all of the axon terminals that innervate the individual muscle fibers. Collectively, axon plus all the muscle fibers is the motor unit. So the stronger the contraction, you need to increase the number of motor units to be stimulated. Okay?
Increasing action potential not matter? Does that just makes the force stronger?
It does, but then you will then come into the problem of if you increase the frequency, you can either get incomplete or complete tetanus. Okay, so complete tetanus, you're going to reach that maximal tension and plateau, but if you want to continually increase the contraction, then you have to recruit more of those motor units. Okay? And so all of that kind of gives rise to this term called tonus, being able to maintain some sort of contracted state. All right. There are, a little bit further up on me. There we go. Two major types of muscle contractions. The first one is isometric. So if you tease out that vocabulary, iso means same, metric, think ruler, is going to deal with length. So this is a contraction that will maintain the same length, all right, but the tension will change. So a good example of that is if I have that barbell or some sort of weight that ends up being your resistance, and I hold that weight and keep my arm still, that's muscle contracting to kind of keep it there and preventing from hyperextending. All right, so in that case, the tension will increase in order to oppose that force, the weight, but the muscle length stays the same. All right, a good example, all of your postural muscles, all right, the muscles that go down the length of your vertebral column, all right, that keep you upright or slouched, depending on how you like to go. All right, all of those muscles are continually contracting to keep you upright. And so the muscle length of those, the length of those muscles does not change. All right. On the other hand, if you have isometric, you also have isotonic. In this case, tension stays the same, but you can change the length. Iso, same, tonic, tone, or tension. That can be subdivided into concentric or eccentric. So if you're out there at the gym, that's your thing, or if you're even moving some boxes where you're going to flex and extend, you're going to exhibit isotonic contraction. All right, concentric means that, okay, if I'm holding this barbell, dumbbell, at arm's length, and then I elicit a movement that brings it closer to the body, all right? The length has changed. It shortens as I bring that weight closer to my body, but the tension stays the same. When I extend, I exhibit eccentric or eccentric contraction, all right? And so the muscle lengthens. So you can just kind of hold your bicep and do this for as long as you want. You can feel that change in tension, or sorry, change in length as you flex and extend, okay? That's easy definition questions. Any questions? Okay, all right. Now, in terms of kind of evaluating the muscle to maintain or even reach a particular tension, that all depends on the sarcomere. In particular, it's going to depend on that cross bridging and binding site relationship between actin and myosin. So we've always shown you a sarcomere where you've got some overlap, all right? In order to have muscle contraction, remember you've got those actin and myosin proteins working with each other, playing that tug of war. And so for any muscle to reach an optimal tension, it has to have some sort of optimal length, all right? So number 2 is the easiest. So you've got length, basically percentage of resting sarcomere length versus tension, all right? So if you have some overlap, as in the case in number 2, all right, that if you have the minimal amount or adequate enough overlap, then that means you're going to reach the optimal tension for that particular muscle group, because you've got some space there in order to have that tug of war or cross-bridging action between myosin and actin. If, however, at rest, you have too much overlap, as in the case of number 1, then you don't have enough opportunity to generate those cross bridges between those two proteins. So the tension is much lower. If you look at this individual graph, here's the optimal tension. If you look at the tension of this one, it's smaller, okay? On the flip side, if you go at the other end of the spectrum, if you have a sarcomere at rest where it has very little overlap to the point where it's kind of overstretched, it will never be able to make any sort of cross-bridging formations. So the tension is very small in relation to the optimal length or optimal tension, all right? So the amount of tension or force is going to depend on that optimal overlap between those two proteins. Yes? No? Okay. All right. Now, how does skeletal muscle get its energy? We know by this point that aside from calcium as that signaling molecule, you need ATP, all right, in order for that myosin head to elicit some sort of power stroke. Right? And so there's roughly 3 types of energy sources. So what I have here that I got from an old lecture is 2 scenarios. Energy that you use and obtain at rest, and then of course during exercise. And so right now, everybody here is undergoing aerobic respiration. You're taking in oxygen, you've got enough oxygen that's going to go to your skeletal muscle cells in order to keep you erect and maintain posture, okay? Some of that energy that you generate from aerobic respiration is also going to be used to sort of generate some reserve energy, All right, and that reserve energy is in the form of creatine phosphate. Okay, so here at the top in blue, I wish I was tall enough. You've got in the blue box aerobic respiration to generate some ATP. That ATP is going to be used to maintain tone and posture. Some of that ATP is going to be utilized to generate something called creatine phosphate. So in the presence of ATP, that's your reactant, plus creatine, you can generate creatine phosphate, and I'm going to abbreviate phosphate as PO4, plus ADP. Can everybody see that? Reactants yielding your products. That's what this is. Okay? We're good? All right. Now, if you're doing some strenuous exercise, whether it's going to the gym or gardening, mowing the lawn, something that's going to involve you running out of breath, perhaps. All right? We'll start out initially aerobic respiration, and then after some time of strenuous activity, we're not taking in enough oxygen, all right, to generate ATP, so we switch to anaerobic respiration. Well, one of the byproducts of anaerobic respiration, as you already know, is lactate or lactic acid building up in your skeletal muscles. That burn, all right, that you feel and you want to quit, but you can't, all right? That lactic acid or lactate can then undergo some sort of conversion that you should be familiar with. That whole Cori cycle scenario where lactic acid gets shuffled to the liver, gets converted eventually into glucose and shuttled back to the skeletal muscle. All right, so here's that little arrow happening where you can generate ATP for muscle contraction. All right. The third one is now we've got some reserve ATP. So usually, if you don't replenish your ATP stores and you're still doing exercise or you're doing some short bursts of activity, you're going to use that first one up there that we generated. All right, you're taking this creatine phosphate and essentially going in the opposite direction. This is what you need. So you're going to take this guy, break it down, all right, creatine phosphate, breaking it down for energy into creatine, plus you've got inorganic phosphate. Combine that with ADP, boom, you got ATP available for active muscle contraction. So those are your three sources of energy, all right, at rest as well as during exercise. All right. Now, when you are exercising, all right, most of that energy very early on, okay, depending on your intensity, it's usually going to be classified as mild exercise. So typically as you're starting to exercise, most of that energy that we use is actually derived from fatty acids, all right? Fatty acids come from lipids, all right? And through processes beyond the scope of this class, you can take fatty acids and break it down even further, use some of those products to generate glucose within the body, gluconeogenesis, okay? As you increase intensity, then you're going to switch from fatty acids and move using glycogen. Glycogen that you find stored in muscle, okay? Glycogen you either find in the liver or in the muscle. And if you run out of the one in the muscle, you're certainly going to tell your liver to break down its glycogen during strenuous exercise, all right? So here in this particular graph, you've got, well, two. One is for exercise, 0 to 30 minutes. Here on the right is from an hour and a half to 2 hours of exercise. Why anybody would want to do that, beyond me. But at any rate, in both cases, during mild exercise, when you're just starting out, most of that is going to be from fatty acids that have been, as lipid metabolism has taken place. As you increase the intensity of that exercise, then you're going to switch. You're still going to use a little bit of fatty acid, but you're also going to utilize glycogen and a little bit of glucose that's been hanging around in your bloodstream. All right? Any questions on energy? Okay. Now, say you have been doing some strenuous exercise and then you stop. You're in that resting period, all right? But you're really not resting. Your heart rate's still up. You're still breathing heavily. And that's because you've got some sort of oxygen deficit that needs to be repaid. So when you've done some strenuous exercise and you've been utilizing anaerobic respiration as well as your creatine phosphate stores, you're going to have to now take this time to bring in as much oxygen, all right, to replenish the things that you've used, all right? So bringing in oxygen pays for all that increased respiration and that increased heart rate that you experience during exercise. It will also pay back energy that you used in order to convert lactic acid into glucose. Movement from the skeletal muscle to the liver and back. All right. You've depleted your glycogen stores, so this will be a time as you bring in oxygen to replenish some of those glycogen stores. Myoglobin is very similar to hemoglobin. Have you heard of hemoglobin? If not, you're going to learn about it in respiration. So it's like hemoglobin. Hemoglobin likes to bind to oxygen, so this is the muscle's version of an oxygen carrier. And of course, the energy that you use to generate creatine phosphate has to be repaid. All right. So even if you've stopped exercising, your body is still working hard. Okay, because you've been in that anaerobic state for such a long time, you're going to have to pay back what you used. All right. All right. That being said, not all muscle is created equally, all right? There are your book says, 3 major muscle types. And it all depends on their ability to generate energy or use energy in the presence or absence of oxygen. It needs glucose, oxygen, okay? The first one is called type 1, or slow twitch fibers, all right? Slow twitch fibers depend on aerobic respiration, all right? These are fatigue resistant kind of muscle fibers, all right? I'll show you that in the next slide, all right? The second one are what are called type 2 fibers. Type 2 can be subdivided into type 2A, and then in my day when I was in your shoes, it used to be type 2B. For whatever reason, they've changed it to type 2X, okay? Type 2A is sort of the in-betweener, all right? It can act like type 2 collectively are called fast twitch, all right? These are ones that are going to run out of steam a lot sooner than slow twitch fibers. All right, type 2A is kind of in the middle, all right? So it can act like a slow twitch, it can act like a fast twitch. So this one can go between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Type 2X rather, I keep wanting to say type 2B, and that apparently is not correct anymore, all right, are those that are very dependent on anaerobic respiration. All right. So here's a graph showing you the 3 different types of muscle fibers. All right. A is a fast twitch muscle fiber. More specifically, it is the type 2X. So it reaches the maximal tension or optimal tension very quickly and then kind of peters out over time. Okay? B is going to be indicative of your type 2A fibers. So it also reaches its ideal tension very quickly, but unlike type 2X, it can maintain that for a longer period of time. C, on the other hand, is your type 1 fibers. All right, so it takes a while to reach its tension, but it can maintain it for a much longer time before tension drops down back to 0. This one will probably make more sense. I got this from another lecture. All right, better book, in my opinion. So, slow twitch, okay, are the type 1 fibers. These are going to be utilizing aerobic respiration. So sometimes they're called oxidative, all right, because aerobic respiration requires oxidative phosphorylation and the electron transport chain, that messy business, all right. So slow twitch fibers are going to have more mitochondria. The mitochondria are going to be bigger in size. So if you've got bigger mitochondria and you've got more of them, you're going to have lots of energy available for muscle contraction, okay? So hence they're fatigue resistant, all right? In humans, those are going to be your postural muscles that are constantly contracting. They're also going to be found in your lower limbs than in your upper. Makes sense? Your lower limbs are supporting your body weight, so it has to maintain contraction, all right? If you are a marathoner, okay, all of us here have our own unique muscle fiber profile. Marathoners, because they can run those 26.2 miles in 2 hours and a couple of seconds, will have more slow twitch than fast, okay? They're endurance runners. So slow twitch fibers are also morphologically smaller than fast twitch, but you can see that there's going to be more slow twitch than fast twitch fibers in a marathoner. On the other hand, if you are a sprinter, you're going to have more type 2 fibers or fast twitch. So type 2A is going to be both oxidative as well as glycolytic. That's either aerobic or anaerobic. Type 2, okay, X is going to be glycolytic, okay? And so fast twitch, if you think of the sprinters are never going to be able, I shouldn't say never, but we'll have a harder time making the 26.2 miles, all right? They start out really fast and then they slow down when they reach whatever race they happen to be running, all right? That's because fast twitch fibers are fewer and smaller than those in the slow twitch, all right? They also respond very quickly to nervous stimulation. So you'll find those types of fibers mainly in sprinters. For us that don't run or don't like running, it's going to be your upper limbs, okay? Your upper limbs tire out more so than your lower limbs because of this, because of the fast twitch fibers. All right. Since it's fall, we can always apply this to Thanksgiving. All right. If you eat turkey or duck, all right, here you get to choose between dark meat and white meat. All right. Dark meat is your slow twitch. The white meat is your fast twitch fibers. All right. Duck is a really good example because they're migratory animals. They fly for a long time before they reach their summer home, or winter home rather. All right. Do they stop? Generally no. So duck wings, all right, will typically have a lot of dark meat. That's because it's loaded with mitochondria, loaded with myoglobin. All right. Okay. Any questions on muscle fiber types? All right. Now, you're always going to have some sort of muscle fatigue. Why does that happen? All right. Basically, you've increased your phosphate concentration. All right. That means you've increased your ADP concentration. So what does that tell you?
Can you repeat that?
You've increased your phosphate concentration and you subsequently increased your ADP concentration. So what does that tell you? Do you have energy?
No.
No. All right? You've got a decline in ATP. Okay? So you got to take time to replenish that. You also have a depletion in muscle glycogen. All right? If you spent all this time contracting your muscles during some sort of strenuous activity, you've used up glucose. You've used up the glucose that came from glycogen. So fatigue occurs because of muscle glycogen depletion. Okay? Now, as we exercise, if we go to the gym, that sort of thing, all right, you can increase or decrease muscle mass depending on what type of exercise you do predominantly. So aerobic respiration, generating ATP in the presence of oxygen, will typically decrease a muscle mass, or at least a gain in muscle mass. Or another way of saying it is you develop lean muscle mass. All right? So which of those fibers, type 1 or type 2, exhibits aerobic respiration? Type 1. So type 1, if you look at the cartoon, are smaller in diameter than type 2 fibers. All right, so you have lean muscle mass. All right, anaerobic training. All right, so aerobic is like walking, running. All right, anaerobic training is going there and lifting dead weights. All right, that causes an increase in muscle mass. Why? Because you've got type 2 fibers that are being utilized during weight training. So thicker in diameter type of muscle fibers, then you increase muscle mass. Now, two words kind of get tossed around synonymously. They kind of mean the same, but they're not. Hyperplasia versus hypertrophy. All right? As you train, you can increase either the size of the muscle cell itself, that's called hypertrophy, or you increase the number of cells. Okay? That's hyperplasia. All right? Okay. Any questions on that? We're almost done with skeletal muscle. Promise. Then I'll start talking about smooth and cardiac. All right. Now, skeletal muscle is obviously under the regulation of the nervous system. And so there are two structures that you find within, around muscles that are going to be important in sending some information to the central nervous system. The first one's called the muscle spindle apparatus, right? Or just the plain old muscle spindle. All right. The other one on the following slide is called the Golgi tendon organ. And so the muscle spindle, named so because it kind of looks like a spindle, all right, is going to send information to the central nervous system about muscle length. All right. As you are doing whatever you're doing in your life, this little guy here is firing some signals, sending it via a sensory neuron back to the nervous system. And so the nervous system sends sort of output signal via a motor neuron, all right, to tell that particular muscle to adjust its length, essentially. All right, and so the muscle spindle, so here's a cross-section of a cross-section and up-close diagram of a muscle spindle. And so you've got two types of fibers. Within the muscle spindle, you have intrafusal muscle fibers, right? On the outside of that muscle spindle, you'll have extrafusal muscle fibers, all right? And so the muscle fibers that are within the spindle are the ones that are sending information about muscle length to the nervous system, all right? There's a variety of different sensory fibers. One that you should be familiar with is just called the annulospiral sensory endings. All right, so they kind of essentially wrap themselves around the intrafusal muscle fiber and send out information to the central nervous system. The central nervous system sends out a motor response. All right, and it can send a motor response depending on what that muscle needs to do via two types of motor neurons. The first one is a gamma motor neuron. And a gamma motor neuron is going to stimulate those intrafusal fibers, right? This particular type of motor neuron is going to be good to send that motor output for fine motor control. All right, so where are you going to deal with a lot of fine motor control? In your fingers, as you write, as you play the piano or your favorite instrument, all right? Alpha motor neurons are going to stimulate the extrafusal fibers. And so the extrafusal fibers of the muscle spindle are going to be good for eliciting gross skeletal muscle movements, all right? I used piano as a good example, well, I don't know if it's a good example, but as an example for the first two sections. So gamma motor neurons are stimulating your fingers to move over those 88 keys, all right? Alpha motor neurons are going to be found to actually allow your arms to move back and forth across the piano itself, all right? Good? Okay. Golgi tendon organs are going to monitor the tension in that particular muscle or muscle group. So you find this Golgi tendon organ in the tendon, all right? The tendon that connects muscle to bone, all right? So it's a sensory receptor. More specifically, it's a proprioceptor. So think back to what proprioceptors are. They're very good at sending information to the nervous system about the things that are going on in joints, muscles, and the like, all right? And so here this little guy is just measuring the tension of that muscle. And so let's say, for example, it reaches a critical tension value. Well, that signal is sent to the central nervous system. And so in order to negate that increase or over tension, if that's even a term, that alpha motor neuron that stimulates the muscle itself is inhibited. So the Golgi tendon organ is very good at allowing an inhibitory reflex to occur during muscle contraction, okay? So that would be that's a good indicator of making sure that your muscles aren't overexerted at any given time, all right? It's a little bit more complicated than that, but let's just simplify it and leave it at that. All right. Any questions on skeletal muscle? Okay. Switching gears a little bit, okay? We're done with skeletal muscle. Let's talk about smooth muscle for a couple of minutes. All right, smooth muscle cells are spindle shaped. Each of those cells has one nucleus. All right, so if you want to do the compare and contrast thing with skeletal muscle is multi-nucleated. All right, it has sarcomeres, but the sarcomeres are not sitting end to end in smooth muscle. So hence it's non-striated. All right, so here in this cartoon, you've got a smooth muscle cell, you've got your sarcomeres that are sort of randomly oriented. They don't have Z discs, okay? So these sarcomeres are anchored by what are called dense bodies that sort of dot the cytoplasm of that smooth muscle. All right, so here these purple dots are indicative of those dense bodies. Unlike skeletal muscle, which has these T tubules that dive deep into the muscle fiber, you don't have that in smooth muscle. I said muscle fiber, skeletal muscle. You don't have that in smooth muscle. All right. Instead, you've got what are called caveolae, these sort of little indentations or pockets where the sarcolemma kind of dips a little bit, but not diving deep into the cell. All right. So that has some differences in smooth muscle contraction as well. So smooth muscle does not follow the all or none response law scenario. All right. That also means that contraction of the smooth muscle typically lasts a little bit longer than skeletal. Okay, skeletal muscle, it's very quick. All right. Whereas smooth muscle takes some time and is maintained for a longer period. All right. And so that also means that smooth muscle contraction, while it still needs calcium as its signaling molecule, calcium in this case doesn't bind to troponin. Okay? Here's why it's slow. Remember, in skeletal muscle, you've got this action potential that travels down the T-tubule, stimulates some voltage-gated calcium channels, calcium goes into the cell. That doesn't happen in smooth muscle. All right, smooth muscle typically involves some sort of signaling molecule. It can be a hormone, in this particular example, binding to a receptor that happens to be coupled with a G protein. All right, so G protein gets activated and it stimulates a calcium channel. This calcium channel is not voltage gated. Okay. So this calcium channel opens, calcium, as always, floods into the cell, but instead of binding to a troponin molecule, it binds to a molecule called calmodulin. Okay? If you didn't know what that word meant, you can tease it out. Cal, the beginning part, calcium, modulin means to modulate or regulate something. And so here, your little calcium ion binds to calmodulin, and that interaction is going to activate an enzyme called myosin kinase. Myosin kinase, any kinase, is going to involve ATP, breaking down ATP. So here's myosin kinase in magenta, right? It's become an active enzyme. So it takes ATP and breaks it down into ADP plus inorganic phosphate, and that little bit is going to allow myosin to lock its head onto actin and cause that power stroke. Okay? So it takes a little bit longer for all of that in relation to skeletal muscle. The second thing is that relaxation occurs a little bit differently. In skeletal muscle, all you need to do is remove